Hello, my name is Torkel Klingberg. I'm professor in cognitive neuroscience at Karolinska Institute. And here I'm going to give a short overview of the neuroscience of working memory. And the earliest knowledge about the neural basis came from lesion studies from Carl Pribram and others. And Carl Pribram was actually the first one who used the term working memory as a memory for the future, for future plans, or a kind of prospective memory. Then in the 1970s, researchers such as Joachim Fuster and Patricia Goldman-Rakich were able to directly record the electrical activity of neurons when they performed working memory tasks. And later we had the revolution of the imaging technologies, first positron emission tomography, and then later in the 90s, functional magnetic resonance imaging. And here researchers tried to combine both knowledge and terminology from cognitive psychology with knowledge from neurophysiology of non-human primates and direct measurements of humans performing working memory tasks. But the first knowledge we have about the neural basis came from the 70s. And one of the tasks used to investigate working memory is the delayed response task. And in this task, a monkey is fixating in the middle of the screen, and then a cue is flashed somewhere. Then during a delay, the monkey maintains fixation in the middle of the screen and remembers this position. And then when the fixation cross disappears, the monkey indicates that it remembered by moving its eyes up to that position, to the remembered position. So it's during this delay period, which is the critical working memory period, when information is retained online. And what they noted was that during this period of time, there is elevated firing in neurons in the prefrontal and parietal cortex. And this was then taken as a kind of the neural basis of how information is retained in working memory. So this is different from long-term memory. Long-term memory requires remodeling of neurons and synapses, protein synthesis, etc. But here the information is retained through a pattern of electrical activity instead. And the parietal and frontal areas can be seen here to the left in this picture. Another question is, how is the information coded? And here the answer seems to be that it's coded through activity in different neurons. So if a neuron, if a monkey sees a cue and remembers a cue at 90 degrees, it's a 90-degree neuron that keeps the information there by firing during the delay. And we know enough about the neurophysiology of neurons so that researchers has actually created simulations of how these networks could function. And one simplified model of that is to the left in this picture. So the green triangles there are pyramidal neurons, excitatory neurons. And after having seen a cue then at 90 degrees, it's the 90-degree neuron that fires, and it gets feedback to itself and to its neighbors, and through positive feedback, a higher activity state is retained. And this is what's called recurrent activity. And what this models suggest seems to be very consistent with what's seen in many human studies too. So here, for example, we see delay activity. It's a meta-analysis combining information from 30 studies of visual working memory. And as you can see, we also in humans have the frontal and two different prefrontal areas activated. Here is a simplified overview of roughly what human activity looks like. Of course, depending on what kind of information that we're retaining, if it's verbal information or if it's spatial or object, we have slightly different sensory areas activated. But there also seems to be a common network, a frontoparietal network, which is kind of key for working memory. And this fact could be the basis for the limited capacity of working memory. Because if both visuospatial working memory tasks and verbal working memory tasks make use of the same key network here, it means that they will disturb each other. You will have interference if you try to do two things at the same time. But one could also draw another conclusion, and it's that if you could enhance the functionality of this key network here, you could have transfer. It would be useful for both visuospatial and verbal working memory tasks. So the difference between working memory and long-term memory is partly in terms of time intervals. Working memory is when we retain information in consciousness, online, usually for a couple of seconds. For example, remembering an instruction until you solved it, or keeping relevant information while you solve a problem. Long-term memory, on the other hand, can retain a memory for minutes or hours or years, and it's not online all the time. You store it and then later you retrieve it. Working memory has this capacity limitation. We talk sometimes about the magical number 7 plus or minus 2. Long-term memory does not have this capacity restriction. It's restricted because of other things like forgetting or interference. Working memory is coded through sustained electrical neuronal activity, while long-term memory requires structural changes of cells and synapses. Working memory depends on many regions, but there seems to be a key network of frontal and parietal regions, while long-term memory is crucially dependent on the medial temporal lobe of the brain, including the hippocampus, which is necessary to encode memories into long-term storage. One should perhaps also mention the role of dopamine for working memory. There are many transmitter substances that are important, including norepinephrine 2, but dopamine is perhaps the most well-researched transmitter substance. And what is the view is that it's not that more dopamine is always better, but that there is an inverted U-curve so that you have an optimum in the middle. And if you have too little dopamine transmission, drugs that increase the amount of available dopamine can enhance actually working memory capacity. So to summarize, this could be seen as a framework or as a kind of a standard model for especially visuospatial working memory. It's dependent on frontal and parietal regions. Information is retained through recurrent activities of neurons, positive feedback loops, while we keep this information online. And it is a network of frontal and parietal regions that are a key network and presumably responsible also for the capacity limitations of working memory. Thank you.